Welcome, everyone, and thank you again for joining today's workshop. My name is Dante Small, and I'm a Zoom developer advocate here. I'm excited to be joined by my teammate, Max, who I'll allow to introduce himself.
Hey everyone, my name is Max. I've worked here at Zoom for about 4 years as a developer advocate. And during that time, I've had an opportunity to work with our sample applications as well as Zoom apps. So hopefully today we can bring that all together for you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Max. So here's what we have in store for you today. We're continuing from our last workshop, and instead of building, we're actually going to be breaking the Zoom app we built. You'll see exactly how we can troubleshoot the Zoom app in a standard browser. So this could be Google Chrome, Safari, and how you can troubleshoot your Zoom app inside the Zoom's embedded browser. So let's have a look at our agenda. We'll start by covering what you need to participate and follow along with this workshop. Then we're going to dive into some common issues developers encounter that we see all the time on the developer forum. After that, we'll have a hands-on session where we'll discuss what's next, and we'll wrap up with a little bit of Q&A. But first, let's define a very important term, web view. A web view is an embedded browser that a native app can use to display web content. Now, you may be asking yourself, what is the difference between a native and a web application? I get these confused all the time. A native application, unlike a cross-platform one, is primarily written in languages such as Objective-C, Java, C++, which are languages that are portable and work closely with the system. So in our case, when we say native client, the Zoom app is the native client. So when we put these two concepts together, we have native application and embedded browser. Zoom apps function as a website running within Zoom's web browser. It has custom hooks for interactions and APIs, which provide developers with greater advantages for extending their app beyond the context of a browser. So with this flexibility here, it opens up a world of code reuse where between your browser-focused app and the parts of your application that you want to display within the Zoom client. This can be within a meeting. This can be before a meeting, after a meeting, and during a meeting. So think of it this way. With JavaScript running inside a web view, your web app can call native system APIs, thus allowing your app to go beyond the limitations of a typical web browser experience and interact more deeply with the Zoom client during a meeting, after a meeting, and before a meeting, creating more richer and integrated experiences for your users when leveraging your app, and more importantly, more touch points. So now that we understand what a web view is, an embedded browser, and native applications are, let's take a look at what we will be breaking today. So we're going to be continuing from our last workshop and focusing on the simple Next.js app we've already built. You can follow along and check out our previous workshop, which is posted on our YouTube channel. Here's a screenshot of what that app looks like. We'll also share a link to the repository so you can clone it and follow along. Each session has its own branch, so you can follow along by simply cloning and switching to different branches as we progress through the workshop. Here's an overview of what you'll need to participate today. You're going to need a Zoom app marketplace app for authorization and SDK credentials. You're also going to need an ngrok tunnel for HTTPS traffic. And the last thing you'll need is Node.js for running your app. Here's what your environment should include, your development environment. You should have an IDE that supports JavaScript, a bash terminal, Git for pulling down the repository, ngrok for HTTPS traffic, and of course, you want to have npm for downloading and importing JavaScript packages. So the first thing you want to cover is enabling development tools. By default, developer tools within the Zoom client are disabled. To enable them, you can run the following commands or update your ini file on Windows. The next thing we want to cover is the Zoom SDK provides a global variable. So all you need to do is tag your documents with the appropriate Zoom SDK tag, and you'll be able to access all of the APIs and events. So we can see in this slide right here, the tag is on the top. And from that, all we have to simply do is just call the Zoom SDK. All right, configuring Zoom app features. So it's important to configure Zoom app features both in the Zoom marketplace and within the Zoom app JavaScript file. Failing to do so will result in errors. So you'll get an error that you can't access this API. And that's generally what we see a lot of times, that you may enable it within the marketplace and then forget to add it to your Zoom app. And then what happens when you go to call the API, you're seeing this error. So you want to make sure that you enable and configure this the access to whatever APIs and events, both in the marketplace along with the Zoom app. Another concept we want to go over is the Zoom operates. Lastly, remember that the Zoom SDK operates within the origin of the Zoom client. So it introduces an OS agnostic user agent header, useful for verifying the origin and distinguishing them from other services, right? So this is what you'll see in if you look at the headers and the user agent, you'll be able to identify where requests are coming from, so you can identify whether they're coming from some other app or whether they're coming from the Zoom client. Now I'll pass it back to Max for the troubleshooting section.
Awesome. Let's move forward and look at our first troubleshooting item here of the day, and that's going to be our OWASP headers. So what I like to call this the white screen of death, similar to the blue screen of death if you've used Windows. But basically, if you're missing these OWASP headers and you go to open your app within the Zoom client, you're going to be greeted with a blank white screen. So it's important that you have those developer tools enabled that Dante mentioned, because those will allow you to look at those errors as they come up, because there won't be really anything for your site to display. And the next type of issue that we're going to look at throughout the demo, okay, go back one slide, please, is the marketplace config issue. And so this is where maybe you haven't added a domain to your domain allow list in the Zoom marketplace, or maybe the home URL for your site is misconfigured. So we'll take a look at kind of what that looks like. And then finally, there's JavaScript errors. So another great reason to have those developer tools is to address JavaScript errors. And we'll take a look at these represented throughout the application that we look at. So here's an example of that white screen of death that I was talking about. We have this app that normally works outside of Zoom, and unfortunately, it's just showing a blank screen here. So what this looks like in the developer tools is we can see we have this JavaScript error here, missing OAuth secure headers, specifically the strict transport security, X content type options, content security policy, and refer policy. So then let's say, for instance, that we've added those headers and we've put an image on our page. It still might not load because we haven't added that specific image into our content security policy. So we'll take a brief look at how we can do that correctly. And then let's say, for instance, we did add that to our content security policy. We'll still want to make sure that we've added this domain to our domain allow list throughout the marketplace. Um, and that way we'll be able to connect to it. If we don't, we'll see this content blocker prevented frame page. And here's an example of what our domain allow list looks like. We'll go ahead and edit that over the course of our demo and look at what addressing all these issues looks like. Another example of a domain allow list here, but this one's populated and more of a real world example. And finally, here we have a JavaScript error. We're using Next.js, so it gives us this pretty display on the page, but we'll also look at debugging with those developer tools. Awesome. So let's dive into this workshop. I'll talk a little bit about the app that we're using. It's what we built out in the previous workshop, so I won't go too much into it, but just enough to make sure that everyone's familiar here. Awesome. So here is the GitHub page for the app that we're going to be working with, and this is the Zoom Apps workshop sample. You can clone this down to follow along if you'd like, if you have those prerequisites. We're really just going to be going through this app and breaking it in some ways, looking at how it's already broken, and then kind of taking that and fixing it as much as possible. Let's see. Okay, so then now let's take a quick peek at what our marketplace page looks like. So I've just enabled this to work as a Zoom app. I have an ngrok URL that I'm serving it at right there. And we have nothing on our domain allow list just yet because our default home URL will be approved there. I've selected one API for use, but we won't really cover those APIs. Specifically, we'll just be looking at how we can load the Zoom app SDK. Okay, great. So let's go over to our IDE and let's begin to look at how this works. So here I have the Zoom app workshop sample that I just showed you from GitHub, and I've got everything running here. I've got the dev server running, and I've also got ngrok running here to serve it for us. So let's take a look at this in the browser. We can see that we have a really simple app here. It just does a server-side check to see if it's running in the browser or not. And that we covered this check and a lot of this functionality in our previous workshop. I'll go over it briefly as we kind of look through the code. We just want to make sure everyone's familiar with what this app looks like and how this app works. So we can see we have an error here. The Zoom Apps SDK is not supported by this browser. And that has to do with how we're loading in the Zoom Apps SDK, and we'll work to fix this in the future. But for now, let's just go ahead and install this app. We can see that now it's opened up in our Zoom client, and because it's in the Zoom client, the install button's gone, and also that error about not being able to load the Zoom Apps SDK is gone. If you've enabled developer tools, you'll have this option if you right-click to inspect element. And from here, we can look at the console, and we can see if we have any errors or anything. It looks like we've got one warning in relation to some width or height of an image, but overall, looks like we're able to use the Zoom Apps SDK because we see this configuration object here, and everything seems to be working. Awesome. How can we change that? So let's go over here to our code base, and I want to talk a little bit about how I'm doing the OWASP headers for our local development server. So here in the next.config.mjs file, I've defined these headers which are required for all Zoom apps. And these just make sure that we have sensible security policies that are in place for our app. And so I've added these headers to the development server. Once we were on a production server, we would want to implement these headers in a different way that made sense for production. But just to see what happens, I'm going to actually comment out this entire headers object here. There we go. And then let's go back. Let's make sure we save this. Perfect. And let's go back to our app. And if we close it and we reopen it, you can see here we're greeted with that white screen of death. So uh, is our app broken in another way, or are we missing our OWASP headers? The way to find out is to inspect the element. And then we can look here at the errors. And we have that error that we saw previously, missing OAuth secure headers. Make that a little bit bigger so we can see it. So we know how to fix that, at least in this case, because we just broke it. We want to make sure that we have those headers implemented here. Now let's say that we wanted to add an image. Go to our home page here. You can see that I pull in this image, but let's pull in a fake image that doesn't exist. We'll save that. And let's head back over here and take a look at our page. Actually, I want to, because of the caching, close that and reopen it. I see. So we're using a built-in image tag here that wants it to be on our own server. So we're going to use the regular old image tag and see if that serves us a little bit better. Okay, let's see. Iteration failed, so let's refresh this page. And now we have implemented a real error. Let's see if we can fix this. These are not the errors that we want, unfortunately. I would assume this is correct. Oh, here we go. There we go. So I was using the wrong, it's IMG. It's been a while since I've used the strict HTML image tag. And once we have our image tag in there, loaded correctly, we can see that it doesn't want to load that PNG because it's not in the image source directive or the default source directive of our content security policy. So let's go back over here to our content security policy as we've implemented it for development anyways. And we're going to add an image source that allows images from ourselves, first of all. Otherwise, we won't be able to load that logo that I already have in React. And then we also want to be able to load the URL that we just tried. So that fake website .fake.png right here. So there we go. We have that there. Now our CSP allows us to load in this PNG. We could just add fake website here and we can reload. Okay, so we have allowed it through our OWASP header, but now we're seeing that the content blocker prevented the frame from displaying because we haven't added this domain to our domain allow list. And so that's going to be the next step for us. in order to get this image that ultimately doesn't exist uh, to display on our page. So here we have our domain allow list. I just need the domain for what we put in here. And so now that we've got that fake.website domain included in here, we'll just want to reinstall our application. Oops. Just want to reinstall our application. So I'll go back to our site, click install now, and that will make these changes available to our app. And so you can see now we have this little question mark logo here, which means it's attempting to load that image, but ultimately that image does not exist. So let's go ahead and remove that from our page. Awesome. Okay, and now the last thing that I want to address is the error that we see when we are not in the Zoom client because our app is attempting to load this Zoom Apps SDK regardless of if it's in the browser or in the Zoom client. So let's give it a concept of where it's running when it attempts to load that. And we can see that we already do a server-side check to see if we are running in the browser or if we are running in the Zoom client. So we can make use of that. And let's just briefly go over again how that works in case you weren't able to attend the first workshop. So as Dante mentioned, there will always be a Zoom Apps user agent that's available when you're running in the Zoom client. And there can be some issues with hot reloading when it comes to modern web frameworks like this. And so right here, what I have is a middleware function that checks if we're running in development. And if we are, then it looks for that Zoom Apps user agent. And if that Zoom Apps user agent is there, it just injects this header um, and make sure that header is always present. And you could check directly for the Zoom Apps user agent. You could check for this header, but there can be conflicts when it comes to hot reload. So this is the best method that I've found to reliably tell if you're running in Zoom or not in a development environment. So the error that we're getting is happening because right here we load in this Zoom object that I've created. And as soon as you load in this Zoom object, it's going to make an attempt to run some code. And when it's not able to, it's going to give you that error that says the Zoom apps SDK does not support this browser. So what we need to do is use our logic that checks if we are in Zoom to conditionally and dynamically load that Zoom library. So thankfully, there is something that Next.js provides to us, and that is called the dynamic, let's see, I believe it's uppercase. No, it is lowercase, the dynamic object. There we go. And that's going to allow us to dynamically load in these different um, uh, libraries as we need. And specifically what we're going to work with here is Zoom. So we're just going to create an object to hold that value once we load it in. And then right after our is Zoom check here, we're going to create a function similar to the one below it where we have a render install button. We're going to create one for loading Zoom. So I have a function here called load Zoom, where I prefer capital Z. um, and so we're going to say if this is not Zoom, then just return. We don't want to do anything in this function. Um, let me make sure this. Okay, yeah, so remove unnecessary return, making sure that I didn't have a conflict there. So if it's not Zoom, we're just going to return. We want to leave that function entirely. But if it is Zoom, we want to set that Zoom object that we created up above dynamically. So let's see if we can directly import the Zoom file that I showed. There we go, zoom.js. Okay, that looks good. And then, so now that we have this Zoom object populated, we can just directly return it. And that way we can make use of this function in our HTML, similar to this render install button function. So as the first step, I'll get rid of how I called Zoom before. And I'll also want to stop loading it directly like this, because now we're just going to load it dynamically in this function. And that will allow me to call this load Zoom function right there. Perfect. So now we're conditionally and dynamically loading the Zoom library onto the page when it's appropriate to do so. So we reload our page here. We should see that this all still works as we would expect. But what's better is now when we look at our browser, we don't have that error that's indicating we're not able to use that Zoom SDK. Excellent. Well, I think that just about covers everything in terms of how you can use this. Dante, I'll pass it back to you to wrap it up here.
Wonderful, wonderful. Um, one second, I'm going to be sharing my screen. Okay, wonderful. So here's what we have for you guys. Here's some like Zoom developer tips. Definitely want to make sure you read the documentation. Um, Also, you want to make sure you have all your required domains that you will be using. So this includes domains that may be on CDNs. Make sure you have included that in your marketplace domain allow list. And then make sure you are always selecting all the Zoom APIs that you would need when building out, and you want to have that in your marketplace app along with in your JavaScript file. So it's very important that when you enable APIs that you are also making sure that you are uh, adding that along to your configuration for the Zoom app SDK. And when just to plan ahead when devising your plan to build an app, you always want to just keep in mind that you're building between two browsers, so that there may be different things that you have to just consider when building between the two. And what's next? We have this sample app that you can pull down and use to just get up to speed, starting from our first workshop all the way up until this workshop. So you can, if you haven't attended the first one, you can go ahead and check that out. It's on our YouTube channel. This also will be posted on our YouTube channel so that you can follow along and get up to speed. And that's it for today. Do you have anything that you want to add, Max?
No, just thank you for joining, and make sure to check out the developer forum if you have any issues.